Hi, everybody. My name is Sisonke Msimang, and I am a writing fellow here at Wiser. And I am very pleased to be moderating this conversation today. It's a conversation on violence, and it's an intergenerational conversation. And of course, it will be about more than violence. It will also be a conversation about optimism. It will be a conversation about what is possible. And of course, it will be a conversation about resistance. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone who's helped pull this together and acknowledge that it is a partnership, a collaboration between Number 10 Publishers, between Wiser, of course, and Governing Intimacies. So thank you everyone behind the scenes who has made that this conversation takes place in the context of Women's Month in South Africa. And many of you who are joining us today are in South Africa. I am joining you from Western Australia, so it's very late this side. But in the spirit of what we always do here in Australia, we begin by acknowledging the land on which some of us are sitting, and I am sitting on what we call Nunga Buja. The Nunga people are the indigenous people of Western Australia, of this part of Western Australia, and I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from their lands. On territory whose sovereignty has never been ceded. And so I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. The conversationalists tonight are Simamkele Dlakavu and Zubeida Jaffer, both of whom are women I greatly admire, both of whom are activists who have made an enormous contribution to South Africa's democracy. I will introduce them properly in a moment. But I wanted to say that this session is set to run for 90 minutes. We will take an hour to have a conversation, maybe 45 minutes, an hour to have a conversation. I'll take them through some questions. You are encouraged to submit your questions via the Q&A function, not the chat function, I am told by the logistics people. So if you can do that, that would be great. And we'll gather up the questions, and then we'll give ourselves plenty of time to answer your questions and to engage in a conversation with everyone who is joining us online. Does that sound good? I can't see anybody, so I will assume that it sounds good. Okay, so to begin, let me just run through the bios of, I will start with Simamkele. She's a PhD candidate in political science under Saatchi Chair in Gender Politics at Stellenbosch University. She's also a part-time lecturer at the African Gender Institute, where she contributed to formulating and lecturing undergraduate and postgraduate courses, such as development, conflict, and political change, gender and the politics of development, and theories, politics, and action. I worked at the AGI in 1999, a very, very long time ago, Simamkele. So it's nice that we have shared the same halls, albeit in different times, which is why it's so nice to be having an intergenerational conversation. So welcome. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Sisonke, for having me.
Zubeida Jaffer is a journalist and the author of 3 acclaimed books. Her memoir, Our Generation, eloquently tells the story of her emotional journey through the years of South Africa's turbulence into a new democracy. Her second book, Love in the Time of Treason, which is the life story of Aisha Dawood, has been described as a tour de force. And her third book is Beauty of the Heart, The Life and Times of Charlotte Maxeke. Zubeida is a graduate of both UCT and Rhodes University. She also holds a master's degree from Columbia University in New York. She was active in the South African anti-apartheid movement and in the trade union movement. And she, of course, served on the Independent Media Commission for South Africa's first democratic elections in 1994. And she worked as a group parliamentary editor for South Africa's independent newspapers in the 1990s and 2000s. And last year, she received the Alan Kirkland Soga Lifetime Award. Thank you so much for joining us, Zubeida.
Thank you, Sisonke. I know it's 11 o'clock there, but it's 5 o'clock here. So, thank you for bearing with us.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Anything to have a conversation with and about home. So the idea for this conversation really emerged a few months ago. I had this conversation with Zubeida for the podcast that PEN South Africa put together. And in the course of that discussion, what I really enjoyed about the conversation was that Zubeida has this very incredible, positive, optimistic energy. And part of the conversation was talking about some pretty, dark things, obviously, because the apartheid era was no joke. And I thought to myself afterwards, wow, this beautiful energy, I thought it was infectious. And I loved what she had to say about some of the lessons that Mom Charlotte has to teach us. And at the same time, I was also very interested in thinking about this moment and thinking about what the experience of activism has been like for younger women younger than myself. And so one of the first people that popped into my mind was Simamkele, that iconic moment in 2016, where Sima and some of her colleagues, 4 women, stood in front of President Zuma, holding up signs, reminding us in a very powerful silence to remember Kwezi. And so I thought these two women represent something really important about what resistance looks like across time and space in ways that are in some ways very different and in some ways very similar. And I thought it would be productive for us to have that discussion. And I wanted to moderate it because I sit between you. Maybe not like exactly in the middle, maybe closer to Zubeida's side than Simamkele's side, but nonetheless, that I think we represent women across the spectrum. And so I was interested in asking some questions of the both of you. So here we go. That's by way of framing the conversation. So I guess the first question. Sorry, let me find my spot. So I want to begin the conversation with a reflection backwards. And so Zubeida, I will begin with you. Your most recent book, of course, is about Charlotte Maxeke, who we are all celebrating this year. And so I guess the question is, why do you think she is important when we speak both about violence against women, but also more broadly about resistance? What does she embody? What does she represent for all of us?
No, she, Sisonke, she was written out of history. Even in the 70s and 80s, I think she was only really known, amongst people in exile, but not really in the country, because it was never ever mentioned. Her name was never ever mentioned in all those years that I was sort of aware of. And it's important, she's important, and it's fantastic that it's come full circle now, because she demonstrates and shows us that there's been a consistent effort over a very long period of time to deal with the issues and versions of the issues that we struggle with today, that we still struggle with today. And it's important also, and I'm really hoping that many people will familiarize themselves with the story, because it shows us how we have a baton to pick up. We have a baton to pick up from people, she and her circle. We are focusing on her, but it's actually she and her youthful circle. I would like to call the Kimberley circle. They consistently, had a vision for higher education, and they set out to carve the path. They set the education train on its path, and if it wasn't stopped by apartheid in 1930, after she had died, if it hadn't been derailed so badly, then who knows where we would have been. But then we had to waste so much of our time and waste so much energy. Even she, what they did was to, chip away at the edifice of authoritarianism that was imposed on us. And so in the case of violence against women, I was amazed to come across a text of a speech that she gave at the memorial of Nsikana in 1922. This was in Johannesburg, where she not only spoke directly to women about what she expected from them, but she spoke to men as well about what she was expecting from them. And I want to read just briefly what she said, because for me, it led me to give the book the title, to the book's title, and it's made a very, very deep impression on me. She said, she said, it is the beauty of the heart and good behavior that will last until you go to the grave. Beauty is adorable when accompanied by other good things. Before that, she had listed how she expected the young women to conduct themselves. I'm not going to go into all that. It is in the book. But then she turns to the men and she says, we want men to protect the women of their nation, not men who hurt and endanger women when they become aware of their rights. How extraordinary that she could have analyzed the core of our difficulty. Not men who hurt and endanger women when they become aware of their rights. And then she says to the men, we want men who are the salvation of the young girls of their nation, whom can depend on their presence. We need men who will humble themselves so that the nation may lift them up to be the stars of Africa for future generations. That is what Africa wants. That is what the women of Africa are weeping and praying for. Now, for me, it is very particularly poignant because that she could, you could say it's 100 years ago, it's 1922, it's 99 years ago, that she could analyze, and as I said, those who were around her in such a progressive way, what was at the heart of it, that when women assert their rights, their rights, then they are, opening themselves to be hurt. And I think that's a very, very, very important point. There are many other important points that she makes through different speeches. But for me, this really, really deeply touched me because she was prepared to speak directly amongst women and say, what do we do? What is our responsibility? What do we have to do? But then she also speaks to the men. And I find that often today we don't seem to have the balance right. We are angry. We are very angry, rightly so. But in the end, what we have to achieve is a balance in the male-female relations, and a harmonious balance. And all the norms have been thrown out of the window. And we're living through this time where we have yet to shape what that is going to be. We are in a transitional phase. And because of the transitional phase, I think, and as she says it there, we are going from pillar to post and seeing all this violence as a reaction. Of course, Sisonke, I can go on and on about this. I've got a lot more to say about it, but
there's more questions. There's more questions. There's more questions. Thank you. Thank you. I want to ask Simamkele what she, when you think about this quote in particular that Zubeida has just shared, and this notion of a warning to men not to attack women when they know their rights. I think that's a really interesting way of phrasing it. So it's not just men do not be violent against women. It's that there's a particular kind of woman who she is warning men not to be attacking. And that is the sense that once women know too much, they are subject to attack. I find that sort of at the core of the warning that she's giving. And so I'm wondering what you think about her, but more, and that quote, but more importantly, in a sense, I guess I'm asking why you think it matters to know the history of women who have resisted oppression. So Mom Charlotte, but also more broadly, this question about history and women's erasure, which is where Zubeida sort of began the conversation about her, that so many people did not know about her.
Thank you both. Just to answer your question about what I think about Mama Charlotte Maxeke, is that I obviously growing up in this country knew about Charlotte, but as a symbolic figure. So I've been living in Joburg for 11 years now, because I started university at Wits around 2010. And so obviously I knew about Charlotte Maxeke Hospital. I lived in downtown Joburg. I saw the street name. So I knew her as a symbolic figure, because that's what we tend to do to women political icons. We tend to make them symbolic figures. So we post their names on streets or in hospitals or in university buildings. But in 2015, I came across this PhD thesis by Tozama April on Charlotte Maxeke that she completed at UWC, the University of Western Cape. And that thesis was mind-blowing, not only intellectually, but politically, because of the moment that we were experiencing in South Africa, because I was a part of the Forlist movement in 2015 and 2016 that erupted in our university campuses. The Forlist movement, which called for the decommodification of institutions of higher learning and education in general through fees must fall, that called for the decolonizing of our university spaces and curriculum in an intersectional way. And so coming across this thesis about the intellectual and political contributions of Maxeke and her generation was really pivotal in my journey, and as well as the journey of, the feminists that I was fighting and organizing alongside. And I just want to turn to Tozama April's PhD thesis and why it was important for me. So here she says in page 11 of the thesis, Maxeke did not embrace essentialist notions of race, class, nationality, and gender, but tried to foster ethical relations in understanding complex social relations. She understood that women, by virtue of their positions in society, were not considered full citizens. And so by reading that passage, you can start seeing that Maxeke and her generation were thinking in what Kimberly Crenshaw coined as intersectionality. And so it was important for me as a Black feminist, as a Pan-African feminist, to recognize, especially in the wake of criticism from not only white feminist spaces, but also Black political or Black Pan-Africanist spaces, that what is African feminism? What is Black feminism? And upon critiques that, we've imported African-American notions of feminism, to just say that, look, there were women like Charlotte thinking in these ways, trying to show us that oppression is multidimensional and that there are intersecting points of oppression. And so for me, Charlotte is important as a thinker, as an organizer, more so than a symbolic figure.
Thanks, Simamkele. I really love this idea that you're beginning to take us into, which is this notion of women as symbols rather than as real and living people who have contributed so much to the way that our activism has been shaped as a country. I see there's a comment that someone's made in the chat, which is a sort of framing a question around, and it's not a question, it's a comment around the fact that so much of our national story of what South Africa is, how South Africa thinks, how it seeks liberation is framed around men, around men's words, around how men think, about how men have imagined, the future. And so this idea of holding women up only as symbols, I think, is a really interesting and important one that both you and Zubeida in many ways make. When Zubeida says, well, she was a name, but people didn't know about her. And what you are saying is, well, she's a name, and we knew she existed, but we didn't know the depth of her thinking. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. So if we then shift and think about today, if we think about what the challenges are that South African women are faced with on a daily basis in our country, we know that South Africa is one of the most violent countries in the world. We lead on things we should not lead on. We do badly on things we should do well on. So we lead in femicide, we lead in rates of gender-based violence. And so I guess the question is, given that we have a history of women who have resisted and fought and framed intersectional questions and pushed, what is it that 30 years into the post-apartheid period, we still have this very big challenge of gender-based violence? I'll take it back to you, Zubeida, and then I'll take it to you, Simamkele, and then I want us to play a video.
Sisonke, I think that, we opened up the doors of change in 1994. And even though we are saying, and people keep on saying, repeating this, that nothing has changed, it's just the same, etc., that's not really true. I think that the change was very rapid, and that, we not only had the fall of the Berlin Wall, which meant that, the whole political situation changed, and the United States went back to being the dominant, or became the, only power at that stage in the world. And we suddenly, at some point, I started feeling, oh my God, are we are we the 55th state of the United States? Because all these values, all these behaviors suddenly became so influenced by American culture. And so we had many things happening at the same time. We had that coming through. We had being curtailed in the sense that we only had we had sort of had a limited maneuverability, because you no longer had, the East and the West. And so we couldn't choose Cuba and do it the Cuban way, because the whole world was changing just at that point when the negotiations started. So there was that. And then I think that post 94, what was really amazing is the extent to which we placed on the agenda the rights of women. Again, we say, oh, it's, we haven't gone far enough, but if you really look at it, then, the kinds of people that I get to meet and see, and if I just talk about the media, we never, I was amongst a handful of women 40 years ago were journalists. So we've changed so amazingly, but at the same time also, what is I know this is going to be a little controversial. My sense is that we have pulled the girl child and the woman, we've pushed, and we have been tremendously successful in terms of getting a higher profile for women. But at the same time, I feel we have neglected the boy child. We have neglected the young men. We have not defined a different role for them more clearly. we have just, almost said, well, they must sink or swim, but the women are taking over. And if we continue doing that, then partly, I'm not saying it's that's the only reason, but partly the extreme reaction, the violence is exacerbated because you have not only young men, for example, now recently they said the initiation schools are not doing their jobs, so they're getting no sense of who they are and where they belong. Then you have the unemployment, and then you have at every drop and turn, whatever statement is made, I'm always amazed from government is that we are going to give more support to the women. We're going to give more support to the women. We're going to give more support to the women. Now, it's not necessarily wrong, but shouldn't we be saying we're going to give more support? We're going to help both men and women through this difficulty. We're going to help both. I see Simamkele is shaking her head, but the challenge for us is, Simamkele, in our families, how to get the balance right, and students have often asked me, both girls and men and women have come to me and said, argued about these things, the woman expects this and the man. So I said, look, I don't have an answer, simple answers, because we are in the middle of a transition. And we are, sadly, I think this generation is having to pay the price of us trying to find a new way of living. And yes, I think, I'm not sure if I can answer the question now, Sisonke.
No, I think what you've done is raise a great set of things around which there's some head shaking. So I'll take it to Simamkele.
I just want to address one thing, because I don't want to also get carried away. But in my research, I want to respond to the statement that you made, Zubeida, about how we put so many resources into the girl child instead of the boy child, and support. But that's factually incorrect. Because if we look at funding in particular for gender justice of any kind in the global south, here in South Africa, you are seeing a trend that funding for gender justice is going to the men's movement. Most of the funding for gender justice in this country is going to campaigns such as he for she, masculinities, and women's organizations are cash strapped. So the funding and the resources, in fact, are not going to the girl child. They are going to the men's movement to sanitize patriarchy, to make men feel better about themselves, about the scourge. Yeah, that's the only comment that I wanted to make.
Thanks, Sima. I'm seeing lots of yeses in the side panel. So I think this gets us to a very interesting point of difference, and I think it's wrong to categorize it as generational. I think there's a point of difference around how we think about some of these issues. And I think not only is there the issue of funding for nonprofit organizations that is increasingly tending to go towards what is called gender organizations and what is called men's organizations, and very little funding, I think, going to explicitly feminist organizations. But we also do have the reality that unemployment is higher for women than it is for men. That when we even look at youth unemployment, youth unemployment is terrible for everybody, but it's particularly terrible for young women. So I think there are some questions to be raised about what the new South Africa looks like for this generation of young people, and what it particularly looks like for young women. And to that end, Simamkele had sent us this short video clip. It's 3 minutes, and it takes us into the reference list. And I'd love us to play it, because I think it allows us to reflect on what's happening at campuses. So if we can go, that would be great. It's 3 minutes.
There's no sound, Sisonke.
Yeah, there's no sound. Sorry, who's playing the video?
There was never justice. I waited and it never came. And now I have filled the void with the memory of people who helped us put the posters back on the wall. I remember those who, on their way to class, stopped by the library benches and joined in conversations, dispelling victim-blaming myths. In place of justice, there were written demands and there were rewritten ones. There were documentary screenings, disruptions and seminars, confessions, personal essays in newspapers. There were solidarity statements and solidarity protests, bare chests. There were painted backs and shambox. I remember a flooding river of tweets. There were meetings, endless strategies. There were new homes when we needed refuge. There was artwork and candles, more posters, more seminars, more occupations, more conversations, abundance, creativity, magic. I remember the exhaustion, weak. Fraying threads of wool, we tried to stitch ourselves into something. We lost things we didn't even know we had until they were taken. We didn't win. But today, our best teachers remember us and render us anchor points in a greater struggle. They are odes to us, undutiful daughters. We are defended. There is a record of that meeting where management members walked out on us, leaving a room of wet faces. I remember we reconvened in the SRC offices afterwards, shattered. One of the older women who observed the meeting told us that, growing up, she never thought apartheid would end. We were held, still breaking. 5 years later is an impossible destination. We are still at Purple Square begging for futures, and at the same time, we are in different places realizing time gave up on waiting for justice. In the space I wanted justice to fill, I was forced to make room for new things. There was the relief of hurting in the community, the comfort of being seen as a person with a spirit, the clarity of knowing that we were not the problem. There was a moment I felt my spirit exhale. And then came the vengeful blow of an empire threatened. Like a bulldozer, it succeeded in destroying everything except this. I will always know in my cells what it felt like, that moment we stole, that shared memory of breathing and grieving together.
Thanks for playing that.
I've seen it so many times, yet it still gets to me. I just want to acknowledge Yolanda Janji, who's actually here with us today, the woman whose voice and whose face that we see. I also want to acknowledge Khurata, who's also here today, whose words she spoke, and she's doing her PhD actually on the RU reference list. So I just want to thank them and acknowledge them for being here today.
Thanks, Sima. And I guess I wanna start this part of the conversation with where that short clip ended, which is that it ends on a note of grief, which was it's a very difficult thing, I think, to hear as somebody who's older than this generation and who watched with such admiration what was happening on campuses, 2016, 2015, 16, 17. And so I'm interested that grief is where Yolandi ends. And of course, she can speak for herself, and it would be great to get a comment up. But I'd like to ask you, Simamkele, what you think about that as a place to end a commentary on the activism around violence against women of young women of this generation.
Thank you for that question, Sisonke. I know a lot of people focus on grief, study grief, reflect on it politically, and use it as a political tool. However, I'm not the best person. I'm not equipped to speak about it in that way. But what I found most striking in the video was what Yolanda said and Khorata, both of them, about when the statement, "We are not the problem." And I find that statement very crucial, because I see here there's a comment from Professor Roy about how we reduce issues to individuals instead of like the system and systematic issues. And in post-apartheid South Africa, particularly our messaging around GBV and femicide and rape has been focused on the individual, particularly the girl child, right? And so don't dress in a certain way, don't go to certain places. Why were you drinking? All of these mechanisms that are engineered to police our substantive citizenship rights, to police our movement, that Pumla actually writes so beautifully in her latest book called Female Fear Factory. So what I loved about the video was the emphasis that we are not the problem. And so the blame on the girl child or the gender non-conforming person or the lesbian woman or the queer person in this country, what were you doing, where were you, needs to be challenged and stopped. And we need to repoliticize sexual violence and GBV, because I think the challenge that feminists in this country have articulated have been the fact that gender-based violence has been depoliticized. Therefore, our approach to GBV has been depoliticized. Secondly, GBV has been ahistoricized, and so it's been lacking a historical context, because we do come from a slave, colonial, and apartheid past, which had gendered and sexual dimensions, right? And so we don't reflect on that enough and in our policy approaches. And thirdly, I think feminist scholars have spoken to our repertoires of action in post-apartheid South Africa. And something that I'm also still studying is that particularly Amanda Khoos and Shireen Hassim write about how the post-apartheid feminist articulation of protest or even citizenship claims have been to work within the state machinery, right? So we saw a lot, the entering of feminists and women's rights activists post the Women's National Coalition into the state. Something that also the late Dr. Lindiwe Makunga writes about. However, that absorption into the state has not meant the articulation of feminist principles and feminist policies in our everyday, experiences in South Africa. And so basically, for me, I have a huge problem with the ANC Women's League and what they've done to our gender machinery, what they did to Kwezi and millions of other women in South Africa, and the betrayal of the feminist movement and the feminist momentum that was actually fought for through blood, through sweat, through lives. And so, yes, the problem is, as I've articulated, GBV is depoliticized, it's ahistoricized, and our approaches and our repertoires of action to address this issue have been lacking. And that's why then I wanted to play this video to show that my generation of African feminists have taken to direct action to make GBV a political issue, to politicize it, not only the RU reference list, but other articulations of feminist activism that we've seen, such as the total shutdown, such as I Am 1 in 3 protests. So we are beginning to look at direct action as a credible form of political language or a political grammar.
Thanks, Simamkele. I think there's a lot in there, and it begs the question about what do you do with the state? Because ultimately, direct action and repoliticizing the debate is absolutely crucial. But it seems to me as a way to get the state to do what the state must do. And so so the question that I want to ask Zubeida then is, because in 1994, all of us believed very strongly that the responsibility was lay with the state, and that the machinery, the commission that we set up, and Ministry for Justice and the police, that all of these would work in concert to make women's lives safe. So what happened is one form of asking the question. And I think importantly, so let me stop there. Let me ask, was that a wrong strategy? Was that a wrong strategy to invest so much time, energy, and effort into making the state work for women?
Sorry, beautiful question, Sisonke. I'm just, in awe of that question.
It may have been, there was, on the one hand, I say if one had to do this all over again, let's say we suddenly go back to 1994. One of the things I said to somebody the other day, what would have been a wise thing would have been to send some people into the state structures, but to support others to work very strongly within communities. And what was done then was that all the best minds were mobilized and sent into the state structures. And that, I think, and it left the communities bereft of leadership. Often people moved out, which I can understand that also, but we created a gap in the country on the ground. And if we have the wisdom of hindsight, we would say that send some people, key people into state structures, but leave, a substantial number of people on the ground to keep, those street committees and those basic organizations going that can continue the deep conversations within communities. Whereas now we have a situation where people are so disconnected. They are not really, one can't say, voting every 5 years or 4 years, whatever is democracy. There has to be a base. There has to be a deep interaction within each community. And at the moment, we don't have that. We don't have that, and it's a real pity, because we've put a lot of resources and energy into building institutions, which is not necessarily wrong, but we somehow didn't spread. We didn't separate. We didn't separate that from the work that has to be done in every community. And so one of the biggest challenges we have now is that at the local level, we don't have, the kinds of structures that we had perhaps in the 80s, where people felt held by those around them. And so it's a free for all. And so there's a real difficulty with that. And I'm really, really interested in, the kind of work that must be done community by community.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I know that this is a diagnosis that many people have made. The two things that are kind of unfolding in the chat that I want to bring into this conversation. One is this whole question of the ANC Women's League. People are very interested in that. And I think that people are also very interested in talking about boys and men. And I think both of those can become like enormous discussions that I don't want us to get necessarily sidetracked into, but I just want to give voice to the fact that those are live happening conversations in the chat. I do think that the question of investing so much resources in the state has to be thought through a little bit more. I know that continually we go back to that moment and say, if only not everybody had gone into the state. But I think it's true that not everybody did go into the state. I think what happened was the most prominent people went into the state, which isn't to say necessarily the best minds went into the state. It is to say that a lot of the big shots went into the state. And I think what also happened was that too many of the big shots went into the state, and those who stayed outside, there was this narrative that everybody was working on the same page, working together. So the notion of deployment was very much alive and well in civil society. And it took us a long time to recognize that once there was a new state power in place, those guys were not on our side anymore. And so when Simamkele talks about a kind of this notion of repoliticizing gender-based violence, I think where we lost sight of things was that we depoliticized civil society. That civil society was just going to be one arm of the continued revolution. And in fact, we know that in South Africa, the revolution was stillborn, right? That many things happened. So it's not as if nothing happened. I'm not in that nothing happened camp. But I do think even as we think backwards, it's important for us to think about whether or not, in fact, the best minds went into the state. 30 years later, I'm not convinced that those people are the best minds. And then I'm not convinced that we were always on the same side. So if that analysis, if we take that, if we say, okay, we weren't necessarily all on the same side, and that the big shots, and yes, you're right, Atambile, the femocracy, as Professor Amina Mama says, made those decisions. What do we do to dislodge this? What is the way to dislodge the femocracy? And so this leads to this question about the ANC Youth League, ANC Women's League, that people are asking on the side of this chat. Is there still a place for the ANC Women's League? Or is this something, and for those kinds of formations, or is this something that we need to leave in the past? Do we say that the state machinery will take us nowhere and that the only way forward is direct action? And if that is what we are saying, direct action to what end? Yeah, and Simamkele, you can take that question.
So many important reflections. Okay, so I want to start with a question around direct action to what end? I just want to share quotes here. I just recently wrote about this. So from the president and Ramaphosa and Baleka Mbete, these are quotes from the presidential summit on gender-based violence, which happened in 2018. So I'm just going to read some of those quotes, firstly, starting with the Ramaphosa. So he said, in August, I made a commitment that we shall convene the summit to develop a national plan of action against gender-based violence. I made this promise that we will hold the summit, and I'm glad that we've lived up to this moment. This promise was made following the activism by very brave young women in our country, the hashtag, the total shutdown movement. And I'm rather glad that they stood up and decided that enough is enough and that they would embark on the action that they have embarked upon. In quotes, there was Ramaphosa. The second quote I want to share is by Baleka Mbete, same day. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the campaign all over the country, where we saw the women marching and saying enough is enough. Siyabulela makhosikazi. And so I highlight these quotes by Baleka Mbete, who was the then, I think, speaker national chair of the head speaker of parent.
Okay.
And
of the brand.
Yeah, and the Ramaphosa. And then in this particular platform, and in the same year, it was the first time that a state president, to my knowledge, acknowledged GBV as a pandemic. We know, first of all, in the Mbeki years, there's a huge case that went on when feminist activists highlighted in the Mbeki years that GBV and rape in particular were huge challenges. And Mbeki's response was rather very defensive, to say that, no, this white woman is making assumptions and saying that Black men are rapists. So basically, he didn't want to attach any political significance to this growing crisis. And then obviously the Zuma years, we had Zuma, and I believe Fez, Kwezi. And yeah, I don't want to talk about him further. And then, so now with Ramaphosa, we have a state president acknowledging the crisis of GBV. But it's important to know, how did that come about? That came about as he acknowledged, and Baleka Mbete acknowledged, through direct action, through the total shutdown movement, through women saying, Ramaphosa, we're not leaving the union buildings until you come and address us. They stayed, these women stayed there till the evening to get the summit, to get the current plan that we have today, that he spoke about in his Women's Day national address. So that is your answer to the direct action question. We engage in direct action, not for the sake of it, but for political means, right? To make certain claims and certain demands to the states. Because I wanted I couldn't find the exact quote now, by a woman that I admire so much, Kwezi Mbadazai, who borrowed the name to Fezekile Kuzwayo, the name Kwezi, who's a gender justice activist, who was instrumental in this plan and in the total shutdown movement. And after the Remember Kwezi protest, she, along with Bumi from the 1 and 9 campaign, went and had an interview with ENCA and said that we will engage the state because we have no option. The state is ours, and we need to make the state work for us. We acknowledge, as feminist academics and activists have acknowledged, that the state is patriarchal in nature. However, it is the vehicle that we have at the moment, and therefore we have to make it work for us. We lay claim to the state because women fought for this country, women fought for the state, so it is ours too. And so the resources of the state need to be utilized for us too. And so I hope I've answered the questions.
It does. Zubeida, did you want to make a point there about laying claim to the state, that it is that it is in fact ours and it has no choice but to work for us? I think that's a non-negotiable.
Yes, I think definitely. I think it would be a pity if we are, if we don't take that on board, because there's been a lot of work to create a state that is working for us. But so if we just suggest that we're going to go it alone, I think at this point that would be problematic. But the question still remains, Sisonke, if we are going to, how do we do this when there's, for example, the ANC Women's League is not an organization that I think many of us cannot relate to this, and we don't see it as a principled organization. And so what do we do under the circumstances? But I would definitely say that we shouldn't isolate the state and not look for allies within the state.
I just don't trust them anymore. But yes, I
agree. I want to touch on your point about the.
I agree.
Sorry.
It does feel like we are, and many times it does feel like we are alone. Many times, the state abrogated its responsibility during the recent unrest. The state did not do what the state has to do, and that was to secure, to provide the security and protect people against the violence in KZN and in Gauteng. So when we see that, then we start thinking, it's reasonable to think, oh my God, are we alone? Are we having to organize our communities and hope for the best? So the state must be forced to take its responsibility. We're paying people from our pockets, and the state must do the basics that we expected them to do. And definitely security and protection in a violent situation is absolutely crucial.
Thanks, Zubeida. Yes, Sima, you wanted to. Simamkele.
I wanted to speak to the point that you made, Sisonke, about the depoliticized civil society. I think that was an important point, is because it is in fact that civil society has been depoliticized, but also someone made the same point in the chat that civil society organizations were bled dry after 1994. And how we got to this democracy is through actions of civil society, because we are knowledgeable that, post Sharpeville, there was a political vacuum in the country, and political parties were banned, and political leaders were sent into exile or imprisoned. And so we know that to achieve this democracy today, it was through the actions of civil society instead of, the traditional political party structures, particularly in the country, because political parties and political leaders were banned. But post 1994, a lot of, similarly to, women in the feminist movement went into the state, civil society leaders also went into the state. And so it is a challenge. How do we repoliticize civil society in ways that also are not ahistorical, in ways that are grounded and rooted? So the principles of democracy from below, for me, are what fascinate me. And so how do then we also repoliticize civil society?
So I want to take, thanks Simamkele. I think those are really important questions. And I want to kind of link them to some of the questions that have been coming up. So I have a few. Someone has asked, someone says, many questions and comments refer to the need of empowering and educating boys alongside girls as a way of breaking the cycle of GBV. Can the panel elaborate on it? And the reason I'm taking this question is not only that it came up right at the beginning, but importantly, it speaks to this point of repoliticizing gender-based violence. So if it is truly a political conversation, then my instinct when we talk about boys and men is often to just roll my eyes and be like, oh, here we go again, right? But if we are going to take the politics of this seriously, then I think that this is a question that does need some reflection and answer. So the question is, what does the panel think about the need of empowering, I'm saying it the way they've said it, empowering and educating boys alongside girls as a way of breaking the cycle of GBV? So whoever wants to take that one first, please be free, because I'm not answering that one.
I'm also hesitant to answer it, but I'll just try to do it briefly because it's not my area. I think there are people that have done credible work in masculinity studies in this country and boyhood studies, like Professor Kopano and Dr. Gobani Kambela, who I think would be useful. However, I find it interesting, just to go back to the funding question about where funding for gender justice goes and how it's going increasingly to the men's movement, or there's this particular organization, I know I might get in trouble here, that I wanna call out. It's called Not in My Name. I'm still here to like properly write about this organization. It's a men's movement here in South Africa by young men around my age who do protests of not in my name and acquire funding and other opportunities around this. Someone said, affluent levels, I was like, not in my name. They also irritate her. And so for me, funding and recognition is going to these men to do work with our young boys, men who are not themselves feminist, men who are themselves very dodgy, right? Yet they are getting funding, recognition, institutional recognition to do work with our boys. It's like what they do for me is very, like I said, I still don't have the words yet, but it really troubles me. And I turn to Kwezi Lomso again, who said that we need to take back our young boys as the feminist movement. We need to take back our young boys, our children, from these men groups that are further perpetuating toxic notions of masculinity and patriarchy and are making a buck and names for themselves by doing this.
Simamkele, you talking about it from there's a particular problem, and I can't agree with you more, that it's very unfortunate. I was not aware of this, that funding is going to men's movements, and leaving women's movements at a disadvantage. That is one element, and it should be fought. But I'm looking at this problem broadly from the position of families and communities. And I cannot, and I mean, I see it all the time. We see it in our families, we see it in our communities, that we have to pay attention to the education of both the girl and the boy child. Because if we don't, I mean, I'm just looking at it from a point of view of within our families. And if we don't start figuring out what is the new way of doing things as it pertains to both boys and girls, then we are going to have great difficulty as we go along. It's not denying what you said. I want to be very clear about that. But I think if you look at it in a more holistic, a broader view than just the movements, and you look at society and you look at the challenges that people are having within their family situations, then we need to develop more conversations that help people through this. Because it's a real issue. We must have a situation where parents have greater guidance in what they're supposed to, how they're supposed to affirm the girl child, and then what do they also do in terms of the boy child. And there are organizations that are doing amazing work, like the Parent Center, and I'm sure there must be others too, but some of those very, very basic ways of doing things and the ways of helping people through it has to be broadened, because in the end, we need to have healthy families and healthy societies, healthy communities. Yeah. And so it's two different things. I'm trying to say that, Sisonke, the what we need to do politically and how we need to fight it out. But the other thing is, how do we guide and how do we provide, guidance to people who are trying to raise children at the moment? Yeah.
And I think, yeah, and I think in some ways they are one and the same thing. So someone is asking a question about, there's two questions I want to focus on. One is asking about how do we include violence against gender non-conforming people in this conversation? Or how do we integrate gender non-conforming people in our histories and our memories of liberation? So that's one discrete question. And then there's a whole cluster of questions that are going back to this issue of the state. How do we hold the state accountable outside of voting for a different political party? How do we, and I'm not sure why this person wants to make it outside of voting for a different political party. Or how do we mobilize or repoliticize civil society organizations when efforts are so often co-opted? I'm thinking about how the ANC Women's League almost succeeded in co-opting the total shutdown movement. So two questions. One is around gender non-conforming, and then the other one is about the co-option and the state. Go ahead, Simamkele.
I was saying, have they not? You said they almost succeeded in co-opting the total shutdown movement. My question is, have they not succeeded? It's a question up for debate. We're still seeing the outcomes of the total shutdown movement. But I think the question around gender non-conforming people is an important one that needs to be addressed. For me, particularly, the issue around Black lesbian women in this country. It was Black lesbian women who were the first for me to critically make femicide a political issue. And the 1 in 9 campaign comes to mind for me, and the political demonstrations of the die-in, using, the body and using the die-in as a political tactic to show that Black women, Black lesbian women in this country are dying in numbers because of patriarchal violence. What comes to mind is their disruption of a Women's Day / ANC Women's League event a couple of years ago, where we've seen over the years around the framing of Women's Day as a celebration, so happy Women's Day. And so women and gender non-conforming people in the 1 in 9 campaign were like, no, there's no cause for celebration because we are dying. We are not here to celebrate, address this political crisis. And so for me, in answering this question around gender non-conforming people, and particularly lesbian women and queer women in this country, they have led the charge in my eyes. And they continue to lead us in these conversations. And I, by us, I also mean myself, as a queer woman. Yeah.
Thanks, Simamkele. Do you have a comment on this, Zubeida, about short of changing your vote? What are the ways of holding the state accountable around gender-based violence when the state is so unaccountable around so many things, right? It's not just this issue. Look at anything. The state has proven itself to be extremely resistant to accountability. So when we talk about repoliticizing civil society, repoliticizing gender-based violence actions in respect of the state, in some ways, why talk about the state at all?
I think it's necessary, Sisonke, that we revert, or we strongly locate ourselves within broad South African society, and that we speak from that point of view, that we choose, I would say, choose one issue. Let's take just as an example, how fees must fall operated. One of the activists there said to me that they, in that whole exercise, for the first time, they were able to get all the different political student movements, all the different party political student movements on board and move in one direction. I'm not sure how correct that, how true that was, but she explained this to me, and for a short time, everybody put aside their differences and they went, they just gave everything to achieve the Fees Must Fall campaign. Now, I would say that it would be strategic for the political activist groupings like Simamkele and them to choose one issue at a time, if they can, and really, really try and mobilize everybody around it so that we can tick it off the agenda and tell the state, this is what we want this done, and we want it done by then, or whenever we want it done. But I think unless we do that, there's not going to be movement. We could have a whole list of issues. I think that we should define those issues, but then we should focus on one at a time if we think it's reasonable, and then get that ticked off. Because I think what I see sadly and so often is that we have all these political parties, we have all these organizations, we've got everybody, but what is missing, and what wasn't missing during the 80s, was that there's not a strong enough core that draws together everybody who agrees on a particular point and mobilizes everybody on that particular point. That was a very, very strong strategy in the 80s, 70s and 80s. And so it was simpler for one to get people on board just on that particular point. And I mean, I know many examples of that, but it was campaign by campaign. And so a whole shopping list is not going to work, but campaign by campaign. And then we have to know what we want the state to do. We want to know what we want, various other actors, religious organizations, whatever, what we want them to do around that particular issue. And then we must fight for that.
I think the point around alliances and the fact that it was possible to mobilize, millions of people in service of a particular goal. And in the case of before 94, it was obvious that it was the anti-apartheid movement, and it was a challenge against racism. And I think we have a less clear set of objectives and a less and the clarity is not lacking it, I think, amongst feminists. I think that clarity is lacking at a society-wide level, right? So it was easier to have clarity about who the enemy was. The state was the enemy. And I think there is much confusion about who the enemy is today, given that the people within the state look a little bit like everybody. So a question to both of you around what energy and organizing capacity makes you excited right now. Where are the spaces where you have seen something and you think, yes, this is what I'm talking about, more of that, please? Whoever wants to go first.
What was very, it's maybe an odd thing, but what's very missing from the 70s and 80s was the concentration on sort of personal transformation. We moved, the situation moved very much as a collective, and the personal needs of people and their difficulties and challenges personally was mainly ignored. I mean, in the interest of the collective. And I'm particularly, I suppose, interested, because I never, saw it so distinctly before, in groups and organizations that are kind of supporting young women and supporting one another in various ways to self-actualize and to become the best versions of themselves. Because there's both these things that must happen. We have to support one another so that we can be not so alone. under these very difficult circumstances. So we need to talk, we need to reach out, we need to affirm one another. And then the other thing is that we need to make sure that we keep hope alive, so that people are not, pummeled and shown only what is wrong in what they are doing. And actually, that was a very important element in the anti-apartheid struggle, where there was always sharing of what was done that worked. And so then those things were repeated in different communities when they could see that that's what worked, that could be done, that is how one could solve that problem. So whereas now I think that sometimes one feels that there isn't, that we don't have that, but I think that more and more people are realizing that they have to be the change that they want to see. They have to be, we have a choice to make. We've got to make a choice. We can either be miserable, and I mean, there's a lot to be miserable about. I'm not suggesting there isn't. I mean, COVID has given us such a beating. And then what happened with the ANC tearing itself apart in the last weeks, I mean, this is so intensely disturbing for millions of us in the country. And so I'm not suggesting that this isn't a very difficult time, but it's a time that we need to say, what is the choice we're going to make? Are we going to repeat and enlarge that kind of, and it just be absorbed all the time by those activities that are pulling us down? Or are we going to say, okay, those people wanted to be doing that. They want to self-destruct. They want to destroy everything that we've built. But what are we going to do in the meantime to build what we want to see in 5-10 years' time? And I personally have made that decision to commit to use my energy to continue, focusing on hope, helping people be hopeful, and building what is positive. Because I can't see any other way forward. Any other way is to post all the bleakest of stories all the time, to talk to one another and moan, to be sad all the time. And that is not going to lift us out of the situation. It's never ever been possible. It isn't possible from a spiritual, mental point of view. We have to reach out to one another and to really hold each other's hands through this time and assure everybody that we're going to get through it. We often don't think we're going to get through it, but we are going to get through it because we've been through really, really bad times before. We're going to get through it, and we must make that choice now.
Thanks, Zubeida. Simamkele.
Thank you so much, Zubeida, for that. So to answer your question of which pockets of organizing excite me, there are a couple. So firstly is Shais Fuwa, which is like a feminist collective that is demanding a feminist government, a feminist kind of economic policy. I was with them in April this year in Cape Town with women from various movements in this country, working and demanding an intersectional form of justice. So Shais Fuba excites me. And one person mentioned them, the women, the feminist collective, I think Code Red Feminists, that disrupted Didembeweni's virtual seminar. They excite me, and their statement was shared in the chat, so people can go and look out for them. Another space that excites me, that I'm grateful for, is Pay the Grants. the campaign to pay the grants. And so to make sure that during COVID, there was some form of support to unemployed people, to poor people in this country, although 350 Rand could never be enough. But through their campaigning, families in this country have something. So they excite me. And another huge, I think, milestone by this movement is that the grant was taken away by the state. It had given people the grant for a couple of months, and they campaigned again for it to be reinstated. So I'm grateful for the feminists from Pay the Grants. So those, and lastly, I think spaces that excite me is, the 4 lists, because I still see them. Although we are in various spaces, some are in civil society, some are in parliament, some are in media, some are making incredible music and incredible poetry, some are still in the streets organizing. I see them, I'm very inspired by them. And I just want to share like a poem by Makhosa Zanaqaba, and which is an ode to them, just briefly. So the title of the poem is "The Sky Agrees." They show us our shortcomings. Though they feel deceived, they stand up and speak out, demand and proclaim, occupy. They study while sitting, tweet, post, broadcast the revolution. They have changed the new that we thought we had created. Even the sky agrees. The beautiful ones have arrived. So I'm grateful for them, and I work alongside them, and they excite me and hold me accountable every day.
Thank you, Simamkele. So we have 5 minutes, and I think we've covered a lot of ground. And I suppose this last piece of the conversation is where we have to end, because the work continues. In many ways, if I think that the idea of intergenerational fault lines is often overplayed, but I don't want to pretend as if it's not real. And so I think what we do have is a way in which anger as a mode of resistance is the language of the moment. And I think that there is a way that women my age and probably older, Zubeida's age, their resistance was forged, their anger was focused upward and outward, and their resistance was forged in a space that, though it wasn't always safe, was often experienced as safe. And so their language of resistance, once the new state was born, was one that thought about inclusion and accommodation. So we have on the one hand a mode of anger and rejection that is a current mode, which makes perfect sense for these times. And then we had a mode of resistance, which was about making the state ours, which made sense for that moment. And I think between them is this very interesting, incredibly effective thing that ties them both together, which is the sense of shaming those who ought to be ashamed of themselves. And I think that there's one thing that resistance always has to do when it does it well, is to be able to use and mobilize shame to move the things that need to be moved. And so if we think about direct action as a way of shaming the devil, shaming the state, and if we think about the resistance of the 1980s as a way of shaming who was in power, and if we think about the moments in our post-apartheid democracy when the levers of power have actually listened and moved, it has been because we have been able to mobilize shame, whether that takes the form of, of soft words, or whether that takes the form of angry words, I think is a matter of personal preference. But what is interesting and I think important is the way in which we are able to mobilize shame as a tool of resistance. And I feel like if there's one thing that this conversation has helped me to see more clearly, it's that our strategies for shifting the state for influencing it, whether we never seek to speak to it or not. Our strategies around using shame, anger, and resistance are so very important in this moment. So thank you both for your wisdom and your insights and your incredible grace through this conversation. And thank you everyone for asking all these questions and for the insightful points and for the links. So go and find out more about all of the wonderful energies and activisms that Simamkele listed. That was a purposeful question so that we do more and we don't end the conversation with simply clicking leave on the Zoom button. So thank you very much, everyone who participated today. I really appreciate this session.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Happy Women's Day.
Well done, Sisonke.
You're welcome. And please, number 10 publishers, get Zubeida's books, look up Simamkele's writing and authorship, you know, cite Black women, listen to Black women. Their videos are everywhere. Their books and the places in which they have been published are everywhere. So please continue this conversation in that way. Take care, everybody.